Here on Shamer, we have a very special guest, Connor. He runs the YouTube channel Counterpoints. You're probably familiar with his work. I've been following him on Twitter for a little bit now. He's been following me as well, and we had some exchanges in the DMs. And I said, let's do this. Let's do an interview. And so we've kind of been playing like DM tag for a couple weeks now, trying to set this up. I'm glad we finally have an opportunity to talk here.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. And then, I mean, you remind me a lot. There was a few Timcast episodes where I was like, this dude is pretty much saying 80% of what I want to say. That's really nice and refreshing. And then also, you do look like some of my long lost Northeastern cousins. So I'm assuming you have some Irish or some
Yes.
Slav in you or something like that. So, yeah, so
Whoa.
I was like, we'll probably get along famously.
That just went from kind to insulting. All right. Irish. Yes. Slav. Get out of here. I know
All
this
right.
guy. No, I know this guy, Luke Rudkowski. Ugh.
Yeah.
He's Polish. To be fair, I actually like the Polish and the Slavs. But Luke, I find, gives them a bad name. I grew up in a neighborhood outside Chicago that there were a lot of Serbians in. A lot of
Mm.
the Serbian immigrants moved there. They were very industrious and hardworking people. I always really appreciated their work ethic. Really appreciated their work ethic. They were very fun people too. They were
Yeah.
very fun people.
Yeah, I just I have some like Czech and some Yugoslav whatever mix. I'm a European mutt, like
Mhm.
most Americans, so that's kind of
Yeah.
my background.
Yeah, so I'm those in the audience who have been watching me for a while probably know because of how often I get made fun of by the racists and ethnocentrists at Timcast for it. But I'm basically entirely Irish. Got a tiny bit of German in me somewhere, though I don't usually admit to it. And yeah, from the Chicago area. You mentioned you're from the Northeast, or you have relatives from the Northeast.
Yeah, so I was born in Boston originally. My
Okay.
family was originally from there, but they moved down to Florida when I was very young, and I've been here probably like 2/3 of my life. But every 4 years, I move someplace new. So I've been to Japan and San Diego and
Wow.
Iraq for 7 months, and I was worked in Lake County and Orange County and all sorts of different places. So every 4 years, I'm doing something new.
What was so you were in Iraq for a while.
Mhm.
That is really quite an event. I assume
I
you were
did.
deployed with the U.S. military here. You weren't out
Yeah,
there
I
on your
did.
own for vacation.
Yeah, not for vacation. So I no, I did 4 years in the military. I did 4 years in the Marine Corps and deployed to Iraq 0708. It was a relatively relaxed deployment. I had a more relaxed job than other people, but it's still the Marine Corps, so they kick the crap out of you. And then I
Mhm.
did do 4 years in law enforcement, and that's where I saw my more intense things, just because law
Yeah.
enforcement is crazy. But just to give you a brief synopsis, turned 18, I was working dead end jobs, had a girlfriend that I loved, but it wasn't going to work out. Joined the Marine Corps. We broke up, served 4 years, got out, went to college, had some fun, met my wife, became a cop for 4 years, and then now I'm in my mid 30s with two children. And I am also not a friend of the ethno nationalists, but
Yeah.
I have two white children with blue eyes. So,
So
kind
you're
of
basically
crushing
alt-right adjacent.
it. Yeah, yeah, really, yeah, true. And I'm kind of boys with Lauren, so yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely am all
Oh, she's great.
alt light, alt right adjacent.
Yeah, Lauren Southern. All right. There's a bunch I want to get into, by the way, there with your introduction and everywhere you've been and your experience in the Marine Corps. But just to talk about probably the most controversial part of that, being friends with Lauren Southern. Of course, I'm being tongue in cheek here. I think she's fantastic. I met her a few years ago for the first time when she did Timcast, and she really is someone. When you know her in real life, when you have had conversations with her, who just strikes you as like a very authentic, introspective, and sincere person.
That's part of the reason why I think online politics has chewed her up and spit her out is because
Yes.
she's not. I think it's a lot easier when you're a shill and you just get money and then you go through the
Tell me
talking
about it,
points.
brother.
Yeah, but
That's
you
what I'm
have
doing.
no internal internal belief structure. I think that's a little bit easier. Unfortunately for Lauren, she's actually a believer. I've had talks with her, like longer talks about conservatism in general, conservative punditry, kind of her life experiences that made her learn new things about the world. When she went to do her migrant stuff, when we actually did a documentary called Crossfire that was about law enforcement, and then we just got done doing a documentary for Timcast, and that's going to be about I
You were
think it's called
working on that?
Infringe. Yeah, I
I
did
had
a
no idea.
yeah I did a security for them, and I pulled interviews for them.
Wow. Okay. So, firstly, when you hear the struggles, it just like, doesn't it make you so glad that we're grifters who don't believe in anything? right?
No,
Her life
I
is so
really
difficult.
no. I've literally, you know what the problem is there's no billionaire centrists. Like
But
I
you're
need a
like center right, dude. That's the thing. I
yeah.
mean, I people have, and obviously I'm being facetious here, but this is one thing. Everyone, anytime you say anything that upsets anyone, they're going to call you a grifter. Like, this guy, he's just grifting. This lobby's paying him off. It's like, hold on a second. If
Yeah.
I wanted to be a grifter, if you wanted to be a grifter, I think the best possible position to be in grift wise is like, okay, I am completely like libertarian economically, but I won't stand up for like rigid libertarian principles when there's a bailout.
Yeah.
And I'm totally socially liberal, but maybe moderately liberal. I'm not all the way on the far left. If you want to
Yeah.
grift, if you want to make money, if you want to get paid by these organizations, that is the ideal set of opinions. Now, I'm not saying everyone with those opinions is being paid off either. It's possible to sincerely believe things that are incorrect. And this is what drives me crazy about the discourse, right? Like, if there's one thing anyone should be able to deduce just based on a basic study of human history, it's that you don't have to pay people to be wrong. Like,
Yeah.
people are great at being wrong on their own. They're remarkably good at being wrong.
You're okay. You're not wrong in anything that you said. However, I think that there's a correlation. Okay. I'm not saying it's a causation. I'm saying it's a
Oh
correlation.
boy.
There seems to be a correlation between the people who get paid and the people who are very laissez-faire economically, right? And
Yes.
so I think it's hard because on the left they expect you to be economically redistributive. They expect you to want
Mhm.
higher taxes and to go
Yes.
against the rich. And there are a bunch of liberal and progressive millionaires and billionaires who are sympathetic to these things because they think it's going to get them into their secular heaven, basically, if they pay enough
Yes.
taxes. But I think on the right, it's a little bit harder because if you want to promote socially conservative values, it's hard to go to right wing people and say, in order to create even a mildly socially conservative society, we need to enable people to succeed in the first place, and that's going to cost money, and that's going to take tax revenue.
Yeah, well, and this is there's a couple things to dive into there, which is that firstly, um, when it comes to like this position of somebody who you describe these liberals as trying to kind of buy their way into a liberal heaven, I think that's a very real phenomenon. There's there are many ways that Marxism has infiltrated our thinking and rewired the way we see the world. And we usually boil Marxism down to merely being redistributive, but there's so much more to it. And I think neoconservatives and neoliberals have actually kind of adopted this like Hegelian vision of the end of history being brought about by their political position.
Yep.
And this belief that if we just rearrange matter properly, we will end all of the world's problems, like both physical and spiritual. And they wouldn't say it's spiritual, they wouldn't call it spiritual, because I don't think most of them believe in a soul, and if they do, it doesn't actually work into their political framework. But
Mhm.
they would say, rather than the soul, maybe the human spirit or psyche or something
Oops.
like that.
Yeah. No, I'm with you, and I would say that this is going to be my centrist credentials coming out. I would say that you can optimize society, but I don't think that you can make it match one to one with the utopian thing. And then also, there's something that fundamentally doesn't come from government. So you could
Yes.
have
Yes.
like the perfect education system, the perfect redistributive tax code. You could have the perfect secondary education opportunities and job opportunities and all that kind of stuff. And you could build the perfect society. But if people at the end of the day, if they're like spiritually or morally bankrupt, it doesn't matter what institutional smoothing you make to make their lives better. If they themselves are broken, they will end up breaking the system as well.
Exactly.
I think that you can engineer society to a certain degree, smooth out the rough edges, have good institutions that lead people to good results and all that kind of stuff. But if the people themselves are fundamentally like spiritually broken or
Yes.
morally bankrupt, then they're going to collapse the institutions, even if you design the perfect society. And I think that's something that liberals and progressives in particular, liberals, if you just mean that it's like individual liberty, they want, they view any choice as a pure relative choice to any other choice. So doing heroin is just as good as paying your taxes, and
Yes.
being a degenerate hedonist is just as good as being a hardworking family person. And then progressive people, God help them, because they're always obsessed with like helping out the people who are worst off in society. They valorize like bad behavior. And
Okay.
so, yeah.
Yes. So this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. But basically, when we consider Marxism, I mentioned earlier, we think of it as merely having redistributive models, and we think of it as having redistributive models for currency or resources. But what people don't realize is that there is a massive effort to redistribute social capital that Marxists have to engage in to legitimize their regime. So, for example, when you look at the way you described, having a family, caring for your children, going to work every day, or you have somebody who's polyamorous, they're in a throuple, they have sex with whoever they want, they're clearly not contributing, they're doing the bare minimum. The progressive has to assert, if all things are equal, that both of those lifestyle choices are perfectly legitimate, because of course everyone's consenting, and the only factor to consider in
Is
whether an
consent,
action
not
is moral
consequence.
is consent, not consequence, not teleology, not what you're meant for, not what makes man happy, just whether you consented. That's the only thing that matters. We can start and finish the moral analysis there. So these things are both equally good, but here's the problem. There's kind of a paradox where they can't be equally good, because for decades, if not centuries, if not millennia, monogamous men who worked hard to provide for their families were privileged, and polyamorous thruples were oppressed, which means that the family man has always been given an unfair advantage at the expense of the polyamorous thruple or whatever other degenerate or group of degenerates we're referring to. So basically, in order to make this model work where we're all equal, you have to actually redistribute social capital by denigrating the role of the father and of the family, so that you can raise up in status those who are not interested in subjugating their sexual desires to reason.
I It's really funny because I do have a lot of like liberal, progressive, and leftist watchers, and I know I told you about the Hunter Avallone drama. I don't know if you actually caught up on it or not, but it was
No,
basically Hunter Avallone was a conservative for a long time. He's a bigger YouTuber, et
I
cetera, et
remember.
cetera.
Yeah.
He kind of does a hard left turn. He starts hanging out with pundits like Vosh and Xander Hall and all that kind of stuff, and he starts preaching a more progressive lens. And then this is my analysis that a lot of my audience really didn't like. He becomes tolerant of his wife being interested in more aggressive sexual stuff, like creating OnlyFans and participating in the OnlyFans. And then towards the end of their relationship, they break up, allegedly not because of the OnlyFans. But then she, in the wake of their breakup, wants to engage in very aggressive, very lewd, very extreme behavior. And his only concern, even though they have kids together, he's like, well, we're no longer together, so it's no longer my concern. And
What?
that, yeah, and
The
for
mother
me,
of your children is no longer your concern?
and that for me was like it was peak liberalism philosophically. People in my audience did not agree with my assessment at all, but kind of like what you were saying, where like consent is the only thing that matters. So Hunter and Carissa, his ex-wife now, they both consented to breaking up. And then Carissa consented to engaging in very extreme acts that she, as an adult, is technically entitled to. So he has no moral judgment about her making those decisions. And for me, like, my instincts to join the Taliban just shot through the roof. Like I was like, where are the rocks?
Oh
Ahmed,
my
you were
gosh.
right.
The,
Like,
the, the, the
you've
Marine to
gone too
Taliban
far.
pipeline, dude. What's happening here?
Well, you know what happened is we fought for truth, justice, and the American way. And then we came home and we were told that liberalism and progressivism and republicanism is a lie. And it's all just materialist, consumer capitalist bullshit. And then we were told that the ideals that we fought for don't even exist. They're ephemeral propaganda for stupid people.
Yep.
And then we were told, kind of like what you were saying, that our social and economic redistribution should go to subsidizing people who are living lives that we don't respect. And so what's happened is you have this like conservative nihilism almost, where it's like, if you were in the collapse of Rome in, let's say that the Byzantine Empire like 1200 and you saw the Byzantine Empire going down in a landslide, or let's say that you were like in Rome in like 300 and you saw Rome going down in a landslide. Do you sacrifice yourself to try to preserve the empire and institutions? Or do you just say, this thing's all coming apart, I'm just going to worry about me and mine?
Yeah. Well, look, it's an interesting question, and this is something I've said about neoconservatism in the past, and I'll also mention something that I want to sort of build upon with respect to what you were saying about this idea that everything you fought for was something you were then told was a lie later. But to start with the first thing, I mean, when you look at the foundational thinkers of the neoconservative movement, Irving Kristol, even like Christopher Hitchens, he was a massive poster child for the neoconservative movement. A lot of these guys were former Trotskyites, right?
Mhm.
And that's not a coincidence. Irving Kristol described neoconservatism this way. He said, neoconservatives are progressives who were mugged by reality. Okay.
Nice.
Reality, but reality doesn't mug you. The truth sets you free. Whoever sold you that nonsense progressive ideology robbed you. And when you look at the way this philosophy has operated on the world stage,
Mhm.
and this insane belief that we can export democracy, we can turn these third world countries into modern developed nations with western style democracies if we just apply the right military force. It's very remnant of a Marxist utopian idea that we're going to reach the end of history if we only apply the use of state force properly.
Yeah, see, I'm kind of wondering if we actually have a disagreement. So I've heard Douglas Murray, he has this great quote where he talks about like, uh, I I am repulsed by the progressive instinct that people need to be fixed, in
Mhm.
that people aren't just people. Like they want to turn everybody into the perfect mold of a progressive human being. And so they're trying to
Yeah.
constantly engineer every social structure to churn out those kinds of people. And he was fundamentally repulsed by that. But I do think that liberalism, at least what or liberal republicanism, kind of the way that the founders were looking at it, I think that it is a powerful framework for like syncretic like tribes that would otherwise be killing each other to live side by side in relative peace and cooperate on security and economics and all that kind of stuff within the syncretic liberal framework, which is basically I can think what I want to think. I can say what I want to say. You can think what you want to think. You can say what you want to say. We both have the rights to defend ourselves, up to and including against our own government if it becomes tyrannical. And then also, our government is supposed to follow the laws that it sets out for itself. It's supposed to
Mhm.
follow the Constitution. And allegedly, I think that there's a powerful historical case, but allegedly, if we follow this model, completely different warring tribes of religious and racial and ethnic factions can live in some sort of relative harmony and economic prosperity. And so, in that way, I actually think liberalism is pretty powerful. I just think it doesn't have a spine, and that's the problem.
It's I think I would agree with some of that. There's some parts I would disagree with. So I think there are elements of liberalism that can be conducive to peace, and I think particularly in the short term. But you have to be dealing with a group of people who want to have a democratic system at the time. That's one of the major issues I have. It's not necessarily that I would say their way of doing things over there is better. I mean, of course, I wouldn't. I much prefer living in the United States, but it's a question of, are we going to be able to get this group of people to accept this, and should this be our mission? I'd
Oh, if you're
also
talking about
say,
other countries, no, I'm talking about the United States right
oh
now.
yeah, yeah, no, no, well, no, and that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this idea of like exporting Western style democracy to Afghanistan or to Iraq or to these countries in the Middle East, to Yemen,
Well,
right?
how do you feel about Ukraine?
So I am nervous about escalation. I'm nervous about the possibility of there being a third world war or the use of nuclear arms. In terms of like the unique geopolitical factors there, it's not something I've looked into too deeply, so I don't speak about it all that often. I have a couple of opinions on it, but for the most part, it's not my strongest issue. I'm
Yeah.
nervous. Again, everything I hear about it freaks me out. I really liked Donald Trump's answer when he was asked about it. He said he wants to de escalate, he wants to find a diplomatic solution to the problem. But beyond that, I would say the other things I would say I feel pretty strongly about there are that I think that having Joe Biden as president, as this has happened, is not only a massive detriment. I would also add that I think there's a good argument to be made that this is happening because of Joe Biden. You know, there's this idea of like speak softly and carry a big stick. Well, I think Trump spoke very loudly, but he also did kind of carry a big stick. I think other leaders were somewhat intimidated by him. And if I were
Yeah, I guess he could have
Vladimir,
gone wild pretty quick. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
and I think Vladimir Putin, like, look, if I'm Putin and I'm concerned about NATO and I'm considering an invasion, I mean, who am I going to want to go to war with, right? Donald Trump or Joe Biden? One of my favorite things Joe Biden has said, one of the most hilarious, ridiculous stories he's told, which to be fair is probably another fake story. He said, I met Putin, man, and I said to him, you don't have a soul. And he said to me, we understand each other. It's like, hold on a second. You you told another military leader that he's mean? Eh, eh, what's wrong with you? Like this, it's like even if it's just a made up story, for him to say that publicly in a way where Putin's able to hear it and where the Russian people are able to hear it, I mean, that does not project the kind of leadership that you want from a president when we could potentially become embroiled in a conflict with a nuclear armed nation.
Yeah, I'm pretty. This is another thing that we're going to be different on. I think
Mhm.
I think that we're we are a economic empire. We might
Mhm.
not be like a physical empire where the United States physically invades and colonizes place with American citizens, but we are absolutely an economic empire. We want people to be under our hegemony. We want people to do all that kind of stuff. So I view Ukraine as the logical extension of what I kind of lovingly call globo homo, globalist homosexual, where we're trying to spread, this might go back to neoconservatism, we're trying to spread progressive and liberal values through the sword. And I think you're absolutely right that there are people where it's just not going to work. Afghanistan and Iraq are clear examples. They didn't necessarily want it. They ran to theocrats against Americans. They attacked us. They bombed us. All that kind of stuff. I think that when you look at the American interest and the Western interest in
Mhm.
Ukraine, it is the spreading of that economic hegemony. They're looking for to bring one more piece of the puzzle into our economic orbit. And they do have valuable resources. They have a lot of grain. They have a lot of natural gas. They're on Russia's doorstep, so it slights one of our geopolitical allies, or excuse me, rivals. And so as a result, we're really trying to build an international liberal and progressive world order. Now, the problem though is when you have so many people with so many different belief structures and you also don't explain to them that that's what they're fighting for.
Mhm.
18-year-olds think they're fighting for truth, justice, the American way, apple pie, and strippers. That's what they think they're fighting for. Whereas when they actually find out that they're fighting for global commercial empire with progressive and liberal moral values, that's more of a difficult sell to quote unquote go overseas and die for Raytheon.
Yeah, well, and so this is the thing. I agree with everything you've said, but it just makes me wonder how you've come to the conclusion that you've come to, because we're at completely different ends of the spectrum here with regards to the way we feel about this. But I think everything you've said there is accurate. I think that young men who are enlisting to fight in these wars, and granted, like with the United States, we don't have, we're not sending soldiers over there, we don't have boots on the ground, but you can imagine that the vast majority of people who the United States would expect to sign up to fight a war for them are going to be patriots. They're going to be people who are far more socially conservative. And what they would end up fighting for in Ukraine is exactly what you described, the kind of globo homo regime, as it's labeled. Now, I don't believe in spreading progressivism. I don't think it's good. It's not just a question of what people can tolerate. I think what people can tolerate is an important part of the question. So if you're talking about representative government or you're talking about a free market, things that I would agree with, even on those fronts, I would say I don't know that those are things that we're really capable of exporting everywhere. But then there's things that I think we shouldn't be exporting. I think that the world is better off without. And I think a regime of social liberalism and progressivism is one of those things. Because as I mentioned, I think it ends up necessarily redistributing social capital from people who are behaving well to people who aren't.
Yeah, so that's actually something that I probably want to go revisit, because I've talked to plenty of online leftists and kind of understand them philosophically. And I think if you're asking me how are you and I descriptively on the same page, but we're prescriptively arriving at different locations, I think it boils down to: do you think that the Roman Empire is salvageable during its fall? I think that's what it really is. So for me, I'm a Roman looking at Rome, and I look at the republicanism and the history and all that kind of stuff, and I see the great social institutions and military and technological achievements that we've had for the past 300 or 400 years. I look at the explosion of knowledge and literacy and health and access to food, and I say this is worth preserving and propagating. But then I look at like the social collapse and the moral collapse and being unable to articulate our moral values in any kind of way whatsoever that's coherent. And I say, this is a rotten core that cannot stand without some level of articulation. So what I would like to do is kind of like, if Romans kind of like during the fall, they were like, what does it even mean to be Roman? Let's create a coherent vision and identity for the empire, and then let's fight for it in a way that everybody feels like they can fight for. I think they would have had a shot at saving the dream. If Americans were capable of doing the same thing, that's what I would want to do.
So with some caveats, I would mostly agree that I would want for the American people to save this country. But one important point that I think bears stating is that while unity is good, unity cannot come at the expense of truth. And so if that overarching narrative that unites us together in sustaining, the empire, so to speak, is one of like malignance and evil and vice, then it's not one that I could ever justify promoting myself. And that's exactly
Yeah.
how I would describe like
No,
progressivism, global homo, and all of that.
I think you're right that it has to be based on truth. And so I think that instead of telling 18-year-olds that they're fighting for truth, justice, the American way, cherry pie and strippers and whiskey, they need to be told, hey, guess what? You're protecting a 65, $70 trillion global commercial empire. And the reason why your parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts have cheap avocados and cheap apples and cheap microprocessors and all that kind of crap is because of the fact that American military intervention relatively guarantees the security and trade of these free flow or these economic conditions.
I mean,
I mean, if you look at our military bases, that's what they're doing.
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, and I don't think you're incorrect that there's strong economic incentive there to keep a lot of these trade routes going, and that the United States having sort of a global hegemony definitely makes that trade easier. It gives us access to cheaper labor. Even that, I have mixed feelings about. That's probably a much bigger conversation to get into with the question of like local manufacturing and manufacturing within country. I do tend to prefer that, but I do understand it's
No,
not
me
something
too.
that you can. Yeah, but it's also I understand it's not something you're necessarily going to snap your fingers on and get the next day instantly. There's going to be adjustments to quality of life if we want to pursue the goal of constructing more over here.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm a centrist in all these regards.
Mhm.
So I'm not a globalist. I'm not an isolationist. I'm an internationalist. I think nations have to guard their own self-interest while playing into the international order. I'm not a communist or a socialist, and I'm not a anarcho-capitalist. I'm a mixed economy capitalist.
For sure.
So yeah, so if you pick two issues, there's a strong chance I ended up in the middle somewhere.
But then I guess what I would ask you is having this perspective in I think just descriptively, of course, you're right. Nations do have to look out for their own interest on the global stage. But then the question becomes when, the United States has continually expanded NATO eastward and Putin has incentive to not want that to continue. Can't we deduce from that that we're just creating the likelihood that he is going to end up invading one of these states, which he has? And that there probably was steps or were steps that could have been taken along the way to de-escalate and stop pushing out towards that region so that we wouldn't have ended up with this conflict.
Yeah, so that depends on what you want to achieve. And so I'm using like a reptile World Economic Forum brain in order to
Stop
describe
doing
it.
that. Just cut
Yeah. So,
that out.
so what I would say is if you think that Ukraine is on Russia's doorstep, which it is, it's a historical satellite of Russia, which it is, that the Russians are not going to think fondly of them joining the EU, they don't.
Yeah.
If you think that they're not going to be fond of them joining NATO, they don't. Then of course, bridging further and further eastward is a violation of Russia's territorial ambitions. That being said, we also, from the liberal and progressive lens, you have to ask, like, well, what do the Ukrainian people want? And so for me, it's really easy to say, fuck Afghanistan and fuck Iraq, because, excuse my French, we gave them the opportunity to fight for a better future, and they threw it in our face. They said, we don't need your training, we don't need your billions of dollars, we don't want your world, we're just going to throw it away. Whereas the Ukrainians, as far as I can tell, actually are fighting for it. You know, we're 2 years into a protracted military campaign with hundreds of thousands of deaths, and Ukraine still doesn't seem like they want to give up the fight. As a matter of fact, it's an argument. I think that there's a diplomatic solution that's staring us right in the face. And I think it's more conservative than what the Ukrainians want. And the argument that I get is that the Ukrainians won't go for it. They won't make the concessions that I want them to make, which
Mhm.
is insane because they're the people who are suffering.
Well, I mean, I think when you consider the fact that they know that the United States and all of these Western governments are willing to back them up in this war, they probably feel like they have some degree of leverage, and so that they don't need to compromise at this point. So they're going to be less willing
Yeah.
to, just on that
It-
basis.
yeah. So if I could prove my centrist credentials once again,
Mhm.
I think Donetsk and Luhansk should go to Russia, 100%. Like, let them go. They're not coming back into the Ukrainian territory without a lot of blood. Same thing with Crimea. Crimea is one of the warm water ports that Russia lusts after the most. It's an important geostrategic place for them, and it's also symbolically important to Russia. Let it go. Zaporozhye, which is the district that's between Donetsk and Crimea, it looks like the Ukrainians are making inroads into them. I say support Ukraine until they take back Zaporozhye, and then once Zaporozhye is taken, you basically force them to the table by saying, "Hey, it's peacetime now. Give away these things. Let the war come to an end, or else we're no longer going to militarily support you." That would actually be my policy.
Yeah, that's interesting. As I've described, this is not an issue I followed as closely as you have. I'm more just nervous every time I hear news about it, and especially when you hear that Biden is ramping up the amount he's sending over there, that he's called in people from the National Guard reserves. Again, everything I've been hearing from the press about this war and their kind of gung-ho support of it, and just this uncritical march towards continued escalation, the more frightened I am. But what you're saying to me certainly sounds more reasonable than anything I've heard in the media. Again, of course it does, because you're saying something centrist. So even though I don't entirely agree with you, it's better than most of what I'm hearing. But yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I have to consider that, or I'll have to consider that.
Yeah, and see, here's the thing. I think that if you, the one thing that I would want people at home to take away, and I hope you take away as well,
Mhm.
is that I think part of the reason why Americans and conservatives and nationalists are frustrated with the American government is because it no longer serves the actual national interests of the United States. You look at
Yes.
the past like
Well,
50 to 80 years of intervention and all that kind of stuff. It's very clearly not defending the territorial integrity and
mhm.
physical security of the United States of America.
Yeah.
What it is protecting is the international economic interests of the United States, which is an infinitely larger, economically diverse, basically global homo progressive structure.
Yeah, and so this is a huge topic. I again, descriptively I agree, and I think it's easy to point that out. It's easy to point out these economic incentives and say, well, these incentives are economic, and therefore it wouldn't be worth it to the American people. I don't think that's entirely true, and I can tell you agree with me. I don't necessarily think that that is a morally justifiable defense, though it depends on what facet of like economic well-being we're referring to, and also whether the actions we're engaged in overseas are justified. So if there's a serious impending injustice in some other part of the world that it makes sense for us to get involved in, there's a whole set of criteria that I think you have to go through in order to make a case for a just war. But one of the side effects of the just cause could be something like, well, for example, in a completely hypothetical situation, if we're able to keep this trade route open, maybe that allows with us to trade with countries who are able to produce certain ingredients that are necessary for medicines we make that save lives, right? Like it's not as if economic issues are removed from human life. That said, you have to be extremely careful and selective about how you apply that, because that can very easily turn into, well, because every large scale economic action results in some lives being lost or some lives being made easier, we can now justify any foreign intervention on the basis that we're saving lives, and we don't want to end up in that position. So I tend to
This is,
avoid, and so my
yeah.
point is, I reject purely economic reasons for going to war. That said, I do understand that one of the consequences of an otherwise just war could be an economic advantage that does legitimately help.
This is part of the reason why I was looking forward to this conversation because I think that it's really easy if you have like this like historical brain, right? You can look back at the Crusades and you can say, oh, it wasn't even about Christianity or the Holy Land. It was about Italian merchants wanting to get trade routes to the Ottoman Empire, or it was about the noblemen of Europe wanting to get rid of their third son who wouldn't get an inheritance, so they sent him off to war so he could win no territory and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's really easy to get very pessimistic and very nihilistic about like the human spirit and its ambitions and what
Yes.
people want and all that kind of stuff if you just have a material explanation for everything ever. But the truth is that people are infinitely more complex than that,
Hmm.
and often their material motivations coincide with their moral and spiritual considerations. So, for instance, like I joined the military, there's obviously a material interest. I got guaranteed pay for 4 years. I got the GI Bill. I knew that I would be able to get jobs when I got back out. I knew that I was going to be in relative safety. I knew that I was going to be in one of the best militaries the world has ever created, with access to the highest technology on the planet. And on top of that, I would get to play with machine guns and grenade launchers. That's awesome. Like that's cool. That's material interest. That has nothing to do with my moral or spiritual interest. But at the same time, at that time, I was willing to say America got screwed over in 9/11. Thousands of people got slaughtered on live television. This is a grievous crime against humanity. And if I can play a small part in avenging that wrong, then I want to contribute a little bit to it. So I had a material motivation and a moral motivation, and it was really
Yes.
difficult to disconnect them.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's important, and I will stress that it is extremely important to do your best, tie yourself in knots even, to try to disconnect the economic interest so you know you are making the decision for the right reasons. But I think you're correct in saying that it's difficult for a lot of people, and especially when you engage in a historic analysis, it's easy to say, well, there's clearly this economic incentive, so this is why it happened. Well, no, not necessarily. These things are extremely complicated, and also we tend to be very selective about the way we apply that. By the way,
Mm.
because if it's a war that we feel was morally justified, even if we do acknowledge the economic incentives, we don't dare boil it down to that. So it seems to me
Yep.
as if when looking at past wars, every war that ever happened in all of history occurred merely because powerful people tried to confuse rubes into fighting so they could gain territory or resources or status, except for the Civil War and World War II. Except the Civil War, those there was absolutely
Justified.
there were no geopolitical factors at work that could have been like cynically exploited by the wealthy to send people to fight in those wars. They were just good, noble wars. There's no moral gray area there.
Oh, see, you see, as an
There's
Irish person, this is of particular interest because you
Mhm.
basically had, in the Civil War in particular, you had Irish people fleeing the persecution of Great Britain, coming to the United States in droves, and sometimes they were basically said, "Hey, if you serve in the military, you'll be a citizen. Here's a
Yep.
musket, a couple of weeks of training. Go fight for Black people's freedom." And by the
Yep.
way, there were riots in like New York, Pennsylvania, and what I forget. There was another place, but it was covered in Gangs of New York. That entire riot was about the impressment of like immigrants and locals to go fight in the Civil War. So when you go look at history, it becomes infinitely more complex because you can have the noble vision of freeing your fellow man, like the battle
Mhm.
hymn of the Republic. It's Jesus died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, which by the way is one of the hardest lines in like American music ever written. But at the same time, realize that people at the time they were scared. They didn't want to die in the mud, blood, and trenches of some backwater southern, colony or whatever. They didn't want to die for a black person they'd never met before, and so their fear and it morally complicates what we typically view as this like rawly black and white calculus. And I think that history is most interesting when you study those nuances.
Yeah, no, and I would agree. And it's just a little bit, I wouldn't say perplexing because it's actually obvious why this happens. A lot of this is just out of a sense of political correctness and wanting to analyze every other war as a peacenik, and then wanting to analyze the two good wars in the most, like, I guess, PC possible way. You can look at this from multiple angles. You could, like, for example, my grandfather was a World War II veteran. I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of what he did. He fought through Europe for 2 years, and then he liberated the Flossenburg concentration camp. And because he was fluent in German, he actually played a special role in ensuring that SS officers stood trial. I mean, he had an incredible story. He had an incredible story. And when you look back to the Civil War, the fact that there were men who were brave enough to fight in order to end slavery is also a beautiful thing. But you're not able to point out the fact that this was a horrific tragedy. You had brother fighting brother. This was a nation turned against itself. It's those stupid Southerners. They had it coming. Firstly, none of the Union veterans, or very few of the Union veterans, spoke about it in those terms. Yeah, we crushed those dumb Southerners, right? That's not the
Yeah,
kind
they
of
really
rhetoric.
didn't.
Even my grandfather used to say, by the way, that he had tremendous respect for the Germans,
Yeah,
because they fought hard. And one thing he'd say is, whenever anything happened to France, they were waiting for a handout from us. Whenever we bombed a German city, they were out there the next day sweeping and picking up bricks.
right.
So this totally unnuanced contempt for the enemy and lack of respect for those we fought is something which is not only generally not engaged in by people who are actual veterans of these conflicts, but on top of that, it's really ironic coming from people who look at every other war and see everyone on both sides as rubes. And then when they look at one of the good wars, they say, well, this was purely good versus evil. And
Yeah.
no one on the other side was a rube who, was fighting for the wrong reasons, unbeknownst to them. They were all evil, and I'm glad they died.
Yeah. The bitter pill. So I think, like, obviously people end up in all sorts of different kinds of perspectives post conflict. But I think one of the funniest political evolutions of the past like decade has been American conservatives being like, screw Muslims, they're bad people, they support jihadists, they're not going to integrate into liberal or progressive society. We shouldn't take any refugees, which, trust me, I wanted a very aggressive vetting process for people who are coming to the United States from the Middle East and North Africa. But like just being very anti-Muslim. And then what happened was basically, obviously, we had all the terrorist attacks, ISIS got wiped out. And then the terrorist attacks plummeted off the ground. So like now we have, like, it's been 5 years, I want to say, without, like, I can't think of the last major terrorist attack besides like Pulse nightclub or the San Bernardino attack, which I want to say is pushing 5 years now. And then now it's Muslim immigrants who are conservative enough to push back against progressive people in American cities. And they're fighting to say, no, we won't display the pride flag on public grounds
Yeah.
because we don't want ideological flags flown on public grounds. All the liberals and the progressives, they're shitting their pants in that
They
sense.
have
They're
no
like,
idea how
no,
to handle it. I
no.
know.
Yeah, they're like,
It
they're
is a
like,
beautiful thing.
no, like, no, we have to love the gays. Loving the gays is great. And the Muslims are like, fuck you, take your shitty flag off of public grounds. Like,
It's real. No, that's very real.
and then seeing conservatives like kind of like a line behind conservative Muslims, and they're like, yeah, fuck those guys.
Yeah.
It's been a fantastic political evolution.
It's so fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Because on the one
They
hand,
were
there's
they were
almost
sworn
this.
enemies 5 years ago.
Well, there's also like no Muslim ever called me bigot, kind of thing going on there. But at the same time, this is
Yeah.
something that I view in a very pessimistic way. Obviously, I know Muslims, I have Muslim friends, but at the same time, like one thing that conservatives have done over the past several years, and I hate to use this argument because this is something people on the left say, but I got to be honest, they're pretty spot on about this, is, and they won't frame it this way, but white straight men, and particularly white straight Christian men, are too scared to say anything without holding up a minority as a shield and saying the minority is saying the thing. It's like, dude, just grow a pair and say the thing. Like, you're allowed to say you believe marriage is between a man and a woman without going like, well, the Muslims don't want it, so we can't do it.
Yeah.
And I think that conservatives have been hiding behind different minorities and minority groups to say things for them because they're too scared to say it. Look, if a minority group is saying something you agree with, absolutely work with it. This is what I always say. When someone is saying something that's good and you can work with them on solving a problem, you absolutely do it. But also, don't hide behind anybody, right? It's so pathetic. It drives me crazy.
The okay, but this is where I think that progressives and liberals really don't concede that they were. I don't think they concede that like cancel culture was a thing. that for the past
which is
like
insane.
decade,
Yeah.
yeah, the past decade, everybody's been walking on eggshells in order to, survive their sentiments, and that they were worried that if they posted like edgy jokes or the wrong political take or whatever, then effectively a digital mob of a few 100,000 people would call their boss and screenshot their tweets and make them and get them fired and
Yeah.
screw with their livelihoods. And when you're a working class or middle class person, that's not just something that you shake off. You don't just go lose your job and then immediately have a job, lined up the next day that pays the same with the same benefits. It's if you're struggling to get ahead, then you could lose a lot by a vocational cancellation. And then what I think is hysterical is Elon Musk, the richest man on the planet or former richest man on the planet, buys Twitter, and he's like, "Hey guys, it's okay to post again," and everyone's like, like everybody's like, "Yes!"
Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
even me, like I've been going a little hard on Twitter recently because it's like you don't understand. If I was saying these same arguments 3 years ago, I was gift wrapping them in the most like butters. I was covering them in
Yeah.
chocolate and putting raspberries on them and dicing them up for you and making them attractive and putting them on a plate so you could hear what I said. Whereas what I really wanted to say is, here's my perspective, and if you don't like it, go yourself. That's what I
Yeah.
wanted to say the entire time.
Well, and it's something that the left has said for a very long time. And part of what was so hysterical to see when Elon took over was all of these people on the left crying about the fact that their opponents weren't going to be censored. This is no longer a safe space for me. How can I tweet her? Elon never threatened to restrict any of the speech of left wing people. But the thing is, they genuinely see reporting and having people removed from the platform as a form of speech and self expression that they're entitled to. And they actually don't think the platform is worthwhile, or at least many of them purported to not believe it was worthwhile if they weren't given that privilege. And so, what it has led me to believe is that for many of these people, using these platforms was a kind of power trip. I don't think
It
there's any
was.
other way to explain this, right? Like, I am going to get somebody banned for saying something I don't like. I'm going to crush, like, I'm going to turn this conservative who tweeted something offensive with an anime icon for a profile picture. I'm going to project every, not only like conservative who's been mean to me in real life, but people who I have imagined being mean to me based on what I've seen in media about how conservatives behave. And then I'm going to take it out on that person, and I'm going to get them pulled off the platform, or I'm going to call their employer and try to get them fired or smear them in some other way. It's like, what a sick way of engaging. I hate to, this is going to sound so cliche, but like it's an antisocial use of social media. That is explicitly
We
antisocial. Yeah.
we were warning, and by we I mean like reactionary liberal centrist Republicans, conservatives, social conservatives, fiscal conservatives. We were warning for maybe 5 to 7 years that YouTube and Twitter and these aggressive bans and all that kind of stuff, it was not a sustainable event. And what was going to happen was parallel platforms were going to come up, and they were basically going to be the free speech havens that were going to happen. I mean,
Yep.
you're on Rumble right now, and I hear people talk about Rumble and Kick all the time
It's great.
because
Rumble's great.
Twitch is so draconian about their the way that they run things, Twitch with their terms of service, that basically people are fleeing to other platforms. And then when it comes to Twitter, we were lucky enough to have a liberal or libertarian billionaire who was willing to jump on the grenade and buy the platform and tell everybody to go themselves. But basically, like, we dealt with, and by we I mean culturally, the American people, we dealt with probably 5 or 6 years where if you said something racist or edgy or sexist or homophobic or transphobic, then you were banned from the platform or at minimum suspended. And here's the thing about it is there that is a stricter set of laws than even the United States of America
Yes.
has. And on top of that, it's like, when the did it become like illegal to be racist? Like, I can think you're a piece of for being racist, but
Mhm.
I don't want your life to be destroyed.
Well,
And that's like the difference. They want these people's lives to be destroyed for having the wrong opinions. It's insane.
yeah, no, I mean, it's very sad. It's clearly their method of pushing for their regime. It's a way of silencing people into submission. And I'll also say that part of what's so disturbing about it is the fact that there is absolutely no path to redemption. So these are people who will tell you that, like, you know, if a pedophile or a murderer gets out of jail and they've done their time, we just have to trust that they've reformed, right? There are people who really believe this, right? Like, there are people who genuinely believe that someone who's committed a heinous, violent crime can be reformed. But if you said something racist on Twitter 10 years ago, you're just a racist piece of garbage for the rest of your life.
There's two things here.
Mhm.
One, probably this is something that I started accepting 3 or 4 years ago because I already knew that I was like more chill, more tolerant than most people. I'm not a religious literalist, so I think that like religion has like an evolutionary psychological benefit for human beings, but I don't believe in the Trinity specifically. As a matter of fact, I think religiously I'd probably be closer to Muslim than I would be to Christian.
You're off the stream. You're off the stream. I'm hanging up right now. This
That's
is.
fine.
I'm
It's
just gonna.
fair.
No, I'm just gonna put. I'm just gonna write. Hold on. I'm just gonna put a little scroll bar under the screen, and there we go. That's just gonna be there. Next episode. So I hope you enjoy that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to continue talking for the sake of talking.
No, no, I'm giving you a hard. Keep going. No. Explain
No,
because
I'm kidding.
so this is another one
Yeah.
of those areas, the 20% that we
Mm.
disagree on. But continue
Yeah.
because I wanna flesh this out.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is like, um, the hold on. We were talking about
You were saying that
religion,
you believe there's like
literalism,
an
values.
evolutionary psychological benefit to religion, and you
Yeah,
would say you're more
to religion
Muslim.
and yeah, to religion and conservatism. But so because I was making Jordan Peterson Evo psych arguments for religion, and because like I was a little racist because I'll talk about like black crime statistics, but I'm trying to solve that through police reform and education
That's also
reform.
not
But
racist.
I
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
but I'm using their
I get
phrasing
it.
where if you
Fair
point
enough. Fair
out,
enough.
yeah,
Yeah.
where if you point out anything that's bad, then it just means that you endorse genocide against the people
Yep.
for whom the bad things are happening.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then also, but I don't have to get into all my more like liberal or progressive takes, but the point being that like
Not on
because
my
I was
stream.
okay, but because I was more palatable when somebody called me racist or whatever, I was like, yeah, yeah, I'm a little racist. Or like if they were like, oh, you're a fucking sexist. You're like, yep, absolutely, you caught me. And it's like you're a homophobe. And it's like, yeah, I mean, like a little bit. Like it's not. If a dude tried to kiss me, I'd probably freak out a little bit. Like if you want
What
me
a
to hang
low
out with a
bar, though, right? What a
I
low
know,
bar for homophobia.
but see, but that's the thing is like,
I'm
but
not gay. His homophobic.
yeah, but here's the thing: it's like once you accept that you're like this like nefarious label that's associated with like
Yeah.
cancellation or whatever, they lose half of the people who are talking you. They lose their like steam because
Yep.
they don't have the ability to articulate why they think that you are a bad person. All they have is the label, and so
Yeah.
then if you accept the label. The people who have higher ideas, you can have a better debate, and then the people who don't have anything besides labels, they basically shut the up and go away.
No, I actually hear you on that. The trouble, and obviously you don't care about this, and I commend you for it, by the way. But the trouble is, people come in, they clip that. Oh, this guy said he's racist, removing all the irony from it, removing the fact that you're obviously not. But you're correct that, like, in a conversation with a person, when they try using one of these labels, you got to disarm them, right? And no, I'm not racist. I promise is not the way that you disarm people. It's how you. This is another thing.
A little bit.
This is something that like drives me crazy. This is something that drives me crazy. Um, and I have mixed feelings about it to some extent. So conservatives will point out that the left does the things that the left says are wrong, that they're hypocritical. And I think that
Mm.
can be good, but a lot of the left or the real racist rhetoric, or the left or the real sexist rhetoric, or even, oh my gosh, the left or the real homophobes rhetoric, which makes me want to vomit. It's playing into their framework. You're giving assent to their narrative and saying, like, yes, racism, sexism, homophobia, these are the important issues, and you're on the
Mhm.
wrong side of them. It's like, hold on, you're not going to win that argument. You are not going to win the argument by saying the issues they say are the most important are actually the most important, but that they're actually on the wrong side of them. That's not how this works. That's not how you're going to persuade people.
Yeah, I think that that might be an interesting dynamic that I think Sargon of Akkad and I think I've heard him talk about at least tangentially through osmosis. I've heard him talk about like part of the traditionalism or part of the political project that he's on is rejecting the progressive arc of history narrative, that we're
Mm,
always moving towards like a better end. And what really needs to happen throughout societies is conservatives want to conserve like these age old, iron traditions, and then progressives want to progress past them. And then we always come to some new homeostasis that was better than the previous iteration. I
mhm.
actually kind of believe in like the iterative version of history, but at the same time, you and I are in different rhetorical paths because I want to flip progressive rhetoric on its head in order to achieve the political goals I want, which may
Mhm.
be conceding that what they care about is the most important. While I think that perhaps your project would be, let's change the conversation because these are not the
Yes.
most important things that we have to deal with as a society.
Yeah, I think once we cede that linguistic territory to them and we start playing within their framework, using their terminology and saying the problems they say are problems, they win. Now, it's not to say you can't acknowledge that some of these things are real problems, by the way. So, for example, calling someone a cracker or a honky, or saying it's okay when a white person is assaulted, talking about like caucasity, all of these slurs and derogatory language, like that is racist. Okay, it's okay to call that racist. And it's okay, obviously, when Democrats are like calling Clarence Thomas the N word. That's obviously racist, and it's okay to point out that that's racist. But when it's that extreme, to be honest, you kind of don't have to. Just showing that to people, the optics of it are bad enough that you don't need to give any commentary. Um, that said, while I think it can work in small doses, framing the conversation along their lines, I believe, is just always going to give them the advantage.
It might, and this might be my fault conceptually, but I kind of do. I look at the American empire. I look at the material wealth I have. I look at the technological opportunities I have. I look at my healthy, happy family. I think back of my friends that were in the military and law enforcement in college, and I really do feel like blessed. Like I feel like I
Yeah,
was
that's good.
pretty
You should.
pretty but I feel like I was born in the right time for myself. Like I feel like I was born in the right era, basically. I don't long for some lost romantic past or yearn for some like utopian future. I feel like these problems and these benefits are so interesting to me that I'm okay with these being the troubles of my times. So
Yeah.
I like.
Well, if I mean, if you weren't okay with it, it wouldn't do much good. You're stuck here with the rest of us.
Yeah,
But
but then you
I
just
think
you become like a medieval Rome trad posting meme page
based,
on Twitter.
based. So
shout,
here's what I
shout
would
out
say.
to Trad West on Twitter.
I would what I would say to that is there's some strong part of that I agree with. I mean, I believe again. I am Catholic. I'm very open about that. That won't shock anyone in either of our audiences. But I think God puts you in the moment that He puts you in for a reason. He gives you a slice of history. He gives you the opportunity to change it, the opportunity to know, love, and serve Him. And I believe that this, for all of the flaws, and there are serious flaws with this time in history. Again, I believe God has me in this moment for a reason. I think there are problems that He wants me to help solve. I hope, in whatever humble way I can. And I also recognize that there are tremendous blessings. Like the fact that I am able to make a living creating cartoons is unbelievable. Right.
Yes.
The fact that I'm able to not just make a living, I'm able to run a business and employ people who are making cartoons with me. That's incredible. That is a gift from God. I will never understate that blessing. I believe that uh, along with that comes, let's say, spiritual risk, and I would say massive spiritual risk. Right, there's a reason our Lord says in scripture that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a wealthy man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Lefties hear that and they go, see, he's talking about the 1%. No, idiot, he's talking about you. You think you think anyone who lived in the first century is more or was more wealthy than you are? You're out of your mind, right? Now, to be fair, there is a certain level of status that comes along with wealth, just relatively speaking, if not objectively speaking, that would contribute to some negative spiritual dispositions, such as pride and hubris. I get all that, right? But ultimately, like the kind of comfort we have, the kind of luxury we have, the pride we have in the knowledge that we are insulated from nature to a degree that previous generations would have considered to be fantastical is something that can, and I believe does, cause virtually everyone to stumble.
Yes.
So yeah.
Uh, No, so what I was going to say in that is that I think that's part of the reason why, again, maybe not believing in like a literal, like the creator of the universe has put me on this planet in this specific moment in order to achieve this specific thing, but still lean or Cicero or something like that. You can
Yeah.
find parallels into our modern era that
Yes.
are like amazing, and you're like, oh my god, not only am I kind
Yes.
of an idiot for feeling so sorry for myself, but another idiot 3,000 years ago already went through what I went through, and these are the solutions that they already came up with, and they wrote about it, and I'm too stupid to even find the book that tells me what to do.
Okay, that's huge. That's huge. So, firstly, the fact that you can look, I mean, one of the most relatable things to me about the Bible is the fact that in the Old Testament, God has his chosen people and he tells them what to do, and they are constantly complaining about it and not listening. It's
Yeah,
like they're just constantly like, I don't want to, grumbling. And so
I
there's
do that.
there's
I
something
do that.
I do that. We all do that. Or even something this happens in the New Testament where people will be like grumbling. Christ will say something, people are grumbling or even thinking things and they're grumbling, and like he calls out what they're grumbling about. Like he'll openly state. And it's like that's also incredible because you have conversations and the person's like walking like you're like, what's that? Like, do you want to say that
Yeah.
out loud?
They're like,
And
nah.
yeah, and there's an element to like just this passive aggressive grumbling that needs to be called out. And it's interesting that you see that thousands of years ago. That's not modern,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so with
Mhm.
respect to what you were saying about um, there not being, I mean, there is nothing new under the sun. These
Yeah.
temptations are age old. Now, there is an idea of these man-made horrors beyond your comprehension, right? We hear that from
Oh
Nietzsche,
yeah, we've taken
and
it to a new level for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so I think that's legitimate. But yeah, I agree with you. People are people. I mean, there was, this is a super cheesy joke, but there was only one original sin. None of your sins are original. Like
Yeah.
people have done, and this is also what I say to people when they're, if they're a Catholic who's been away from the church for a while, or they're considering becoming Catholic and they're like, but I'm afraid to go to confession. I'm like, I promise you will not say any, I don't care what you think you've done that's like original. You will not say anything in that confessional that will shock that priest, where he'll be like, I've never heard that one before. Like
Right.
people are people fall into the same patterns. And that's why when tradition is dismissed, I find it so frustrating because
Oh, dude, I get so fucking pissed.
yeah,
Sorry for interrupting, but like I get furious because there's people who are intelligent who do this. So I look at Destiny as an example. Just went shooting with him recently. Really nice guy, et cetera, et cetera. But he's a nihilist hedonist. He's in an open marriage. He kind of does whatever he wants to do. He's very rich, very successful, very wealthy. But then I look at some of the social consequences that he pays, and I'm like, bro, like the Bible or the
mhm,
Torah or the
mhm,
Quran or Marcus Aurelius or any of these people would have something to say about your current situation where you are worshiping the wrong gods by worshiping your own
mhm,
intellect and
mhm.
worshiping your own pleasure and all of that kind of stuff. And as a result, you are suffering these consequences. Now, he can look those consequences dead in the eye and say, I want to continue to suffer those consequences because they bring me pleasure. But then I think one of the things that I learned when I was in my mid 20s is that there's a difference between pleasure and happiness and pleasure and
Yes,
satisfaction and
yes,
pleasure and
it's
contentment.
huge.
And if you pursue pleasure, what happens is you have this like very fleeting, ephemeral experience that can feel really good and be very visceral. But as soon as that collapses away from you, you're left with nothing if there was nothing productive as a result of that pleasurable experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And when people look at these age-old traditions and they say this is archaic, this is dated, I have these new ideas. Going back to what we're saying about there being nothing
And
new
you're like,
under the
probably
sun.
not, brah.
Well, and this is, and so this is what I really want to stress. And I think if there's anyone watching this or fans of yours seeing this who aren't familiar with me, or people who haven't really heard me summarize the way I view this really important part of the analysis of ideas, often people think that conservatism versus liberalism or traditionalism versus leftism or modernism is the traditionalist saying, I like old ideas, not new ideas. Here's the truth. They're all old ideas.
Yep.
Some of those old ideas worked well enough to be passed on for thousands of years. And some of them were so insane and destructive and horrible that they were so lost to time that you think they're new.
Yep.
Now, I'm not saying
Oh,
everything you
I think
hear.
we live in a neo-pagan society. 100%.
Absolutely. This is, we are a
100%.
total pagan
Christians,
society. Yeah.
yeah, Christians tried, maybe we didn't burn enough witches. But like we tried.
That's always it. Yeah.
Yeah, we try to stomp out the pagan impulse, but the pagan impulse is very attractive to human beings because it aligns with our nature. And the reason why is because
What's
what
their
do you want to do?
fallenness? But I
You want
agree. Yeah.
yeah, but you want to eat, you want to fudge
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
the CK. You want to do drugs that are pleasurable. You want to pursue your selfish interest. You want to do this, that, the other. It aligns with human nature very well. Maybe fallen human nature, but human nature very well. And so what happens is what we realize through time is that cooperation yields better results than selfishness. That a level of temperance or not giving into your lustful temptations consistently in order to feed that dopamine machine, we realize that some level of temperance and discipline would yield good results. And so we tried to pass that knowledge into the broader population. And we did that via Christianity, we did that via Judaism, we did that via Islam. But then what ended up happening is our pagan natures always rebel against like the religious ideals.
Yes.
And then what's frustrating for me is people, especially nihilists, atheists, anti-theists, and what I view as like neo-pagans who don't know they're pagans, is that they say, well, you failed in your ideal. So why don't you just give up and be a piece of shit just like everybody
Yep.
else? And I'm like,
Yep.
it's an ideal. It's not meant to be completely fulfilled. It's meant to be striven towards. And so if you fail in your ideal, that's not an indictment of the ideal. That's a revelation of your flawed human nature. And
Your
so as a
weakness.
result, yeah, and particularly in Christianity, 100% of the philosophy is about dusting yourself off, admitting that you screwed up,
Yes.
atoning for that screw up, and then trying not to do it again earnestly in the future,
Well,
particularly if you pay the consequences.
and humbly abandoning yourself to God, saying, I can't do this on my own. I'm not strong enough. I'm not strong enough. And I think that one part where I would disagree is I actually do think those ideals are meant to be embodied perfectly. I just think you need help from God, and it's tremendously difficult. And left to our own devices, we're literally not capable as humans in our current state of doing that on our own. But this is why I've said, and I often say, that leftism is just another label we give to social decay. People have these passions, they have these desires, they have these vices. And what we've done over millennia, and this has been a product of humans discovering things, this has also been a product, I believe, in large part of divine revelation, but we've constructed systems or had systems given to us that help in part mitigate the temptation to vice or the effects of vice or our proclivities to want to behave viciously. So we look at monogamy, for example. One thing you hear nonstop from people who want to cope for their own lack of chastity by saying monogamy is unnatural is this claim that, well, human beings, primates who we say are genetically similar to us, are not monogamous. And also, if you look at ancient societies, people strayed.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of adultery that happens in the world today. And so they'll go, well, how can monogamy make sense or be realistic when people want to have sex with people who they're not in a relationship with? It's like, no, listen, dumb.
The point.
That's why we need monogamy. You don't need rules that no one wants to break, right? That's the whole point is people have these desires. How do we channel this desire in a way that is productive for others and also leads to the flourishing of the individual person who has that desire? It's not about, and this is one of the massive problems with left-wing thought is they misunderstand the traditionalist or conservative position. What they think we're saying is monogamy is realistic because the desire to have sex with someone who isn't one's spouse is non-existent. We don't take that reality seriously. No, it's the exact opposite. It's those desires are very real. So if we don't have some standards for people, they're going to end up doing any and every disgusting, degenerate thing. And all of this is going to fall apart. And so
but
I think, well, I just want to wrap up one point I'm making,
no,
and
please
why
go
I
ahead.
say, yeah, I just why use this very strong language, and I say leftism is social decay, is because if you look at a monogamous person versus someone in a polyamorous relationship who's just going around and having sex with everybody, one is very clearly much easier and much in line with what a person's vices and passions tell them to do. One is much more in line with subjugating one's desires to reason, and to forego the subjugation of one's desires to reason in order that you might more readily engage in self-destructive and others destructive behavior that merely gives you pleasure, is the definition of social decay.
Yeah, one of the biggest frustrations, and there was a point like 30 minutes ago that I want to return to, but because I've had it in the back of my mind the entire
Mhm.
time. But I had a gentleman, I believe his name was Ben. We DM'd a few times, and he was really frustrated that I was saying that like I believe that like a two-parent household with a monogamous couple or whatever, including gays sometimes, like
Ooh,
that is a
we
better
disagree there, but yeah.
that's a better structure
Hmm.
than a promiscuous, polyamorous, polygamous situation. And then what he did in that conversation was he divorced my distaste for promiscuity from polygamy. But then I was like, or polyamory. But then I was like, hey, how easy has your situation been where you and your partner have been polyamorous, like hooking up with other people and all that kind of stuff? And he's basically like, it was the hardest in the world and I don't recommend it to anybody. And I'm like, why are you beating yourself up? There's a
Yeah.
reason why.
Yep.
And like I said it as tactfully as I possibly could, but at the same time, I was like, that kind of why are you arguing with me? You are telling me what I'm trying to tell you. But
Exactly.
to return to something that I think is really important that I kind of want to ram home, especially for younger men. Um, I might not be a religious literalist, but I have been called several times. And so what's happened is I've
You've
been
been
in
what several times?
called,
Okay.
called by the
Okay.
creative force of the
That's
universe
what
or
I thought you said. I just wasn't
yeah,
sure.
yeah. And so what happened in these situations was I was in my own path, doing my own thing, being self-destructive, being nihilistic, being hedonistic, and I was looking at my life and I was like, why is everything so screwed up? Why is everything so broken? And then what happened was basically I had this like unfurling of my own life in front of my own eyes where it's like this is what you would need to do in order to get the life that you actually want. And I just saw this path ahead of me of like gonna have to stop drinking, gonna have to stop smoking, gonna have to look for your wife, gonna have to take your job seriously, gonna have to pursue your ambitions, gonna have to, instead of pursuing money, you're gonna have to pursue things that are purposely important to you. You're gonna have to do this, you're gonna have to do that. And I was so annoyed. I was
I
I
know.
was,
I
yeah.
know.
So,
I know.
God or whatever,
But
or the
my
creator of the
idea.
universe,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
he unfurls this like perfect path of like this is how you get where you want to go, and I'm like, you're a asshole. I don't want to do any of that.
Well, the thing is, we would rather have a failure our way than a success his way. We're prideful
Yeah,
creatures. We're prideful creatures. And it's difficult in the moment because
but
you can
fighting
sit.
your own nature is so hard.
Uh-huh. Well,
Like
but this is,
temperance and subsume, like you said,
yes.
subsuming your temptations or subsuming your nature to the rational, or
Uh-huh.
I think you phrase it that
Yeah.
way.
Well, but this is also why I think the Christian framing here is super important, because what we believe with original sin, and you'll hear people say this, so they'll point to something bad and they'll say that's human nature.
Mhm.
What one really important contribution that Christianity gave to the world, one really important truth, is that even though you are inclined to sin, that's actually not your nature. That's not what you were meant for. There's part of you that's broken and is trying to drag you to hell, but that's actually not what you were made for. So when you're fighting vice, you're actually living in line with your nature. Like, but what sin means and what the fall means is like we have to fight to be in line with our nature. Like other animals, right? Humans are creatures. We have a rational mind and we have a rational soul. But animals, they just effortlessly live in their nature, right? Because we're fallen, there's a there's an incongruity between how we're supposed to be and how we want to be. And it's important to remember that, like, because if you think you're fighting your nature, then at some point it becomes impossible. It's like, no, 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 you're not. Like, that's actually not what you're meant to be. Like, you're meant to be something better. But
Yeah.
those desires they're going to drag you down and make you into something disgusting.
Yeah, and I think that's so for instance, we're at least on my end, we're at like an hour and 20 minutes. I get the kids starting to fuss up and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
So
I got to run
if
in a
you're
minute here
good,
too. Yeah.
yeah, so if you're good in like 5 or 10 or whatever, that would be cool. But what I wanted to bring up is we joked about the Warhammer 40,000 universe and all that
Yes,
kind
I
of
didn't
stuff.
get a
You've
chance to
never
watch
gone
the
into
video
it.
you sent. Yeah.
It's okay. You need to. But one of the things that I like about it is a lot of their lore is biblical or scriptural or theological and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that happens in that universe is you kind of become what you worship. So there's like a god of like blood and rage, and there's a god of like excess and hedonism and sexuality, and there's a god of rot and decay, and there's also like a god of order. But ironically enough, the god of order is fallen, and then the question is
Mm.
whether or not the god even exists in the way that people think that he exists, or whether or not it's like this mirage of belief that people delude themselves into thinking so they can perpetuate society. It's actually like a really good commentary on kind of like spiritual conceptions. But what I really like about it is the corruption manifests physically. So if you have somebody who
Mm.
worships rot or death or blood or violence or anything like that, they become more like the thing that they're worshiping. And I think that human beings in reality are like that. We're not so obvious that you can see it on the exterior of people, although you kind of can,
You kind of
but
can.
you
Yeah,
kind of
but
can. But in this universe is blatant. But that's where if you see somebody like this is kind of something that I wish I could take like a lefty or liberal and smash their face into this conception. It's like what you worship is what you become. So if you're a nihilist or a hedonist and you are dark and vicious and cruel and self-centered and mean, it's because of what you're choosing to worship. And I could give you another 5 examples, but I want to spare you from another 2-minute rant.
well, no, no, I think, and I think that's an excellent note to end on. I agree with you on
Mm,
that. People don't realize, and this is something we were talking about on Timcast the other day. But everyone worships something ultimately,
mm.
and people believe this is phrasing I'm taken from Aaron McIntyre, but I really like the way he puts this. He says, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but people naively believed that a separation of church and state would eliminate the problem of conflicting moral visions. It,
Right.
yeah, yeah, it does
Oh,
not. It,
that
it,
hurts a
it doesn't
lot.
at all. Yeah, and it doesn't even come close, right? In some ways, it makes
Yeah.
it worse because what you have are a series of ideological worldviews, which are effectively just false religions, but they
Yeah.
don't purport to have a god, but they do, right?
Yep.
They have a god, they just don't personify him. Like
Yep.
Christians believe in a personal God. Not every god that's worshipped is a personal God. They just believe in a non-personal deity. And so they have religions, but because they're not categorized using that terminology, because we consider an ideology to be a separate thing from a religion,
Yep.
um, we don't forbid any kind of legal action that enshrines that vision legislatively. And
Oh yeah.
so we're in a country where we are absolutely ruled by ideological religious zealots. I think many of them they wouldn't frame it this way, but they're neo-pagan. I think the neo-paganism is in many ways the opiate of the masses, so to speak. Like I have my astrology, and even in a weird way, like I have my Marvel films, which are kind of a strange new pantheon of God.
It was
Yeah,
so funny you said that. You stole it out of my brain.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
I literally think that what's funny is I'm gonna raise my kids watching Marvel movies not because I like the slop or whatever, but because they are the only things that even pretend to have a moral message
Yep.
about the balance of power and intelligence or the power and principle or power like if you take a principle and you combine it with power you can almost associate that with each one of the Marvel characters and then it becomes like almost like a deity and a character
Yep.
study in morality. And what I think is so sad about our society is oftentimes you turn to children's programming and it has better moral messaging than
Yep.
adult programming. And adult programming is all about like sinking into the mire and being the most disgusting, evil sack of selfish you possibly can be, which is fine
And that
for
makes you an interesting character. That's the only way to
yeah,
write an interesting character.
yeah.
Make them a
But I'm okay with that as like an exploratory sojourn into the spirit of humanity or whatever. But I think if that becomes like your entire perspective, then you effectively rot your culture. And that's what I view us as. I kind of view us as a culture that's rolling around in the mud.
I would entirely agree with you. On that note, I think we certainly found the 80% that we agree on. So thank you for stopping by the show, man. Is there anything you want to plug before you run out of here?
Yeah, sure. So, if you want to explore more about, futuristic gods that have captured humanity in a fallen universe and all that kind of stuff, and you want to see a breakdown of that, that's actually my most popular content. So you can type in
Oh,
Counterpoints
cool.
40K, and I have media breakdowns out the wazoo that are doing pretty well. And basically, I explore the universe, I explain the universe, all that kind of stuff. So if you're into that, go check that out. Linked
Based
in the description. Yeah, linked in the description because I had to separate out my political channels from my media stuff because my media stuff was doing better. There will be a debate channel where I post live stream discussions and debates like this. And then there's also an essay channel where if you enjoyed my 2 to 3 minute rants that Seamus and I took turns doing, I do that for 15 to 20 minutes at a time. But it's scripted, it's broken down, it's chronological, and I talk about things that are important. But yeah, no, honestly, I am down anytime. Not only was this conversation very cool, but I feel like we skimmed the surface
agreed.
of the things that we agree, disagree, philosophy, the way we perceive society, all that kind of stuff. So I'd be very happy to do it again at a time of your convenience.
Yeah, likewise, man. I had an awesome time. This was a great discussion, very stimulating. So I think there's room for a lot more of these in the future because there are many topics I really wanted to do a deeper dive into. So yeah, good problem to have. We'll chat again soon.